I spent my entire life trying to fix everything for my family. But no matter how hard I worked, they always found a way to make me feel like I wasn't enough. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room stung my nose as I sat by Mom's bedside, her frail hand resting limply in mine. The doctor's words hung heavy in the air: terminal cancer. 3 syllables that felt like a death sentence, not just for her, but for any hope of reconciliation between us. She looked so small lying there, tubes and machines doing what her body could no longer manage on its own. It was jarring to see Claire, the woman who had always been larger than life, reduced to this fragile shell. For years, I'd told myself I was done being the dutiful daughter, the one who cleaned up everyone else's messes while they barely noticed my existence. Yet here I was again, stepping into the role I thought I'd escaped. At first, it felt like duty, a mechanical response to crisis, but soon, old patterns resurfaced. Every phone call from Daniel begging for money, every passive-aggressive comment from Mom about how strong I was, it all came rushing back, reopening wounds I'd tried to bury. As I drove home that night, the weight of it pressed down on me. This wasn't just caregiving, it was a reckoning. With each passing day, buried truths clawed their way to the surface, forcing me to confront why I'd spent so much of my life feeling invisible. And worse, wondering if maybe they were right. I hadn't been enough. Not for them, anyway, but something inside me whispered that this time would be different. This time, I wouldn't lose myself in the process. The memories surface unbidden, like shards of glass cutting through the present. Growing up, I was the achiever, the one who brought home straight A's and trophies, earning praise from teachers and neighbors alike. But at home, it was never enough. "You're so smart, Emma," Mom would say, her tone laced with something that felt suspiciously like criticism. "But why can't you be softer? Kinda? More like Daniel." Daniel, the golden child, where I was scolded for speaking out or standing firm. He was indulged even when his antics spiraled out of control. As kids, while I sat quietly reading in my room, he'd charm our parents into forgiving him for breaking curfew or wrecking the car. And later, as an adult, when his addiction took hold, Mom didn't see it as a problem to address. She saw it as a tragedy to shield him from. Never mind the wreckage left behind, the lies, the debt, the broken promises. After Dad died, things got worse. Grief turned Mom obsessive, her entire world narrowing to protecting Daniel at all costs. When his struggles escalated, late-night calls from police stations, rehab stints paid for by me, she refused to let him face consequences. Instead, she blamed me. "If only you'd been there more," she'd snap after another failed intervention. "Maybe if you cared enough, we wouldn't keep losing him." Her words stung because part of me believed them. So I tried harder. I emptied my savings to fund yet another treatment program, rearranged my schedule to attend family therapy sessions, and spent countless nights on the phone coaxing Daniel back from whatever edge he teetered on. But no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. Each relapse felt like a personal failure, each argument with Mom a reminder that I'd always come second to Daniel. Now, sitting across from Claire in her dimly lit living room, I hoped against hope that this time might be different. Her diagnosis should have leveled the playing field, forcing us to confront years of resentment and neglect. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine reconciliation, shared laughter over old stories, quiet moments where forgiveness softened the sharp edges of our past. But reality quickly set in. Within days of moving back into her orbit, I saw the same patterns emerge. Every conversation circled back to Daniel, his latest struggles, his needs, his pain. Mine were dismissed as trivial. "You're strong, Emma," Mom said one evening, her voice dismissive as she waved off my offer to help sort through medical bills. "You don't need me the way he does." It wasn't just the words, it was the implication behind them. That strength made me expendable, that caring for Daniel excused overlooking me entirely. Once again, I found myself sidelined, watching as Mom prioritized his crises over everything else, including her own health. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Nothing had changed. I was still the fixer, the backup plan, the one expected to sacrifice endlessly without recognition or reward. And yet, even as anger simmered beneath the surface, guilt whispered its familiar refrain. Maybe I hadn't done enough. Maybe if I'd been kinder, more patient, less focused on work, and more available, things would have turned out differently. The thought gnawed at me, keeping me awake long after the house fell silent. But buried beneath the guilt was something new, a flicker of defiance. What if it wasn't my job to save them? What if their inability to see my worth wasn't my fault? These questions lingered uncomfortably, challenging the narrative I'd carried for so long. Perhaps mending our fractured relationship wasn't about fixing anything anymore. Perhaps it was about deciding what and who I could live without. Managing Claire's care felt like walking a tightrope. Each decision weighted with guilt and obligation. I juggled her medical bills, coordinated appointments, and fielded endless calls from Daniel begging for money, all while trying to maintain some semblance of my own life. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon the bank statements that everything came crashing down. It happened late one night when insomnia drove me to sort through paperwork at the kitchen table. The numbers didn't add up. They never did where Daniel was concerned. Curiosity gnawed at me as I dug deeper, tracing transfers and account balances. What I found made my blood run cold. Claire had liquidated nearly all her assets, properties, investments, savings, and funneled them into accounts under Daniel's name. There was nothing left for me. Nothing. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, the betrayal slicing through me like a knife. How could she do this? After everything I'd done for them. For her, this was how she repaid me? The next morning, I confronted her in her bedroom, the documents clutched tightly in my hand. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. Her expression shifted from confusion to something colder, more calculating, as she glanced at the papers. "I assume you're referring to the transfers," she said calmly, settling back against her pillows, as if we were discussing the weather. "Yes, Emma, I gave most of my assets to Daniel. He needs stability right now. And what about me?" I shot back, incredulous. "You didn't think to leave anything for me? Or even tell me?" Her gaze hardened, and for the first time, I saw the truth etched plainly across her face. "You're strong, Emma," she said dismissively. "You don't need me the way he does." Her words hit me like a slap, sharp and stinging. All those years of sacrifice, of bending over backward to prove myself, and this was how she saw me, as someone disposable because I was strong. My throat tightened, tears threatening to spill over, but I refused to let her see me cry. "So that's it, then," I said, my voice low and trembling. "You've always chosen him. Always. And now you're just cutting me out completely." "It's not personal, dear," she replied, her tone patronizing. "It's practical. You've always been fine on your own. Daniel, well, he can't function without help." I wanted to scream, to shake her until she understood the depth of what she'd done. Instead, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The drive home was a blur, anger and grief warring within me. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew what I had to do. That night, I packed away every photo, every memento that tied me to them. I deleted their numbers from my phone and blocked Daniel's calls. Cutting ties wasn't easy. It felt like severing a limb, but staying would have destroyed me. For the first time in years, I prioritized myself. I threw myself into work, channeling my pain into long hours at the office and taking on high-profile cases that demanded everything I had. It wasn't just about proving my worth anymore. It was about reclaiming it. Outside of work, I joined a yoga class, started journaling, and reconnected with old friends who reminded me there was more to life than the toxic cycle I'd been trapped in. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild, not for them, but for me. And though the scars remained, I realized something important. I didn't need their validation to know my value. Not anymore. The silence in my apartment was deafening. For the first time in years, there were no late-night calls from Daniel begging for money, no passive-aggressive comments from Mom about how I didn't understand him. Just quiet, too much of it. And yet, instead of feeling relief, I found myself haunted, not by their voices this time, but by my own doubts. Did I do the right thing? The question looped endlessly in my mind, a relentless undercurrent beneath every decision I made. Logically, I knew I deserved better than the constant manipulation and neglect. They had taken everything I gave, my time, my energy, my resources, and still found ways to make me feel inadequate. But logic didn't silence the guilt that gnawed at me. It whispered cruel truths. You abandoned them. You walked away when they needed you most. And then there was the anger, a sharp, bitter edge cutting through the guilt. How dare they? How dare Claire dismiss me as expendable because I was strong? How dare Daniel squander everything while expecting me to pick up the pieces over and over again? Didn't they see how hard I'd tried? Didn't they care? But even as the anger flared, it left behind an emptiness I couldn't fill. Memories surfaced unbidden, flashes of happier times before grief and addiction tore us apart. Family vacations where we laughed until our sides hurt. Moments when Claire actually seemed proud of me, like the day I graduated law school or landed my first big case. She'd hug me tightly then, her voice choked with emotion as she said, "I always knew you'd be extraordinary." Those moments felt like lifelines now, pulling me back towards something I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. Was I clinging to them out of love or desperation? Did I hold on because I believed they could change, or because letting go meant admitting they never would? The internal tug of war left me oscillating between extremes. Some days, I felt lighter than I had in years, freed from the weight of their expectations. I threw myself into work, taking on challenging cases that demanded every ounce of focus. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts on a paper in an attempt to untangle the mess inside me. I even joined a yoga class, something I'd scoffed at before, but now found oddly grounding. These small steps toward healing gave me glimpses of what life could look like without them, the kind of life where I wasn't defined by sacrifice and obligation. But other days, doubt crept in like a shadow. What if I had done more? What if staying just a little longer, giving just a little more, could have made a difference? Those questions burrowed deep, surfacing at inconvenient times, like during a particularly grueling trial when I caught myself wondering if Claire would approve of my arguments, or after a long day at the office when I scrolled idly through old photos of family dinners and birthday celebrations. It wasn't just guilt or nostalgia, it was fear. Fear that I was making a mistake. Fear that walking away meant losing any chance of redemption, not just for them, but for me too. Because part of me still clung to the belief that I owed them something, that being strong meant enduring whatever pain came with loving them. Confronting that belief was harder than I expected. Why did I keep returning to relationships that consistently hurt me? Was it habit, hope, or some warped sense of duty instilled in me since childhood? Whatever the reason, one thing became clear. Setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting myself from them. It was about breaking free from the cycle I'd been trapped in for so long. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker below, I realized something important. Healing wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad ones, moments of clarity and stretches of doubt. But each step forward, even the smallest ones, was proof that I was moving in the right direction. I might never fully let go of the past, but maybe I didn't have to. Maybe all I needed was to carry it differently, to acknowledge its weight without letting it crush me. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry, not out of guilt or anger, but release. Release from the need to fix everything, to save everyone. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing myself, for once truly choosing myself. Years passed, and I built a life that felt like my own for the first time. My career flourished, my friendships deepened, and I learned to fill my days with purpose rather than obligation. The weight of my family's dysfunction no longer pressed down on me, at least not as heavily, but scars have a way of lingering beneath the surface, even when you think they've healed. It was a Tuesday evening when the call came, shattering the fragile peace I'd worked so hard to create. A mutual acquaintance, a lawyer who occasionally crossed paths with Daniel, reached out with news I wasn't prepared to hear. "He's hit rock bottom," she said, her tone clipped but tinged with pity. "Squandered every penny of your mother's money, and now he's living on the streets." The words landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. Despite everything, despite the years of betrayal and disappointment, hearing about Daniel in such a state stirred something inside me. Guilt, pity, or maybe just the remnants of love I couldn't fully extinguish. Whatever it was, it left me uneasy. And then there was Claire. She didn't reach out directly at first. Instead, messages trickled through intermediaries, each one more desperate than the last. "She's alone," one friend told me over coffee. "Everyone else has walked away." Another added, almost apologetically, "She keeps asking if you'll come see her." For weeks, I resisted, revisiting that world, the one I'd fought so hard to escape, felt like stepping back into quicksand. But curiosity gnawed at me, along with a flicker of compassion I couldn't ignore. Maybe this was my chance to confront the past once and for all, to find some semblance of closure. If I went, though, it would be on my terms, not theirs. I arrived at Claire's assisted living facility unannounced, steeling myself for what I might find. The woman who greeted me bore little resemblance to the forceful matriarch I remembered. Frail and gaunt, she sat hunched in a wheelchair by the window, her gaze distant. For a moment, seeing her like this softened something inside me. This wasn't the mother who had dismissed me as expendable or prioritized Daniel above all else. This was someone broken, vulnerable, human. "Emma," she whispered when she saw me, her voice trembling. Her eyes glistened with tears, and for the first time in years, I felt a pang of guilt for staying away. We exchanged pleasantries, or as close to pleasantries as we could manage, but the tension between us was palpable. As we talked, Claire began to circle back to familiar territory. "Daniel needs you," she said finally, her tone taking on that manipulative edge I knew so well. "You're the only one who can help him now." My stomach dropped. Here we were again, right where we'd always been. No matter how much had changed, Claire still saw me as the fixer, the one responsible for cleaning up their messes while they refused to take accountability. All the anger I'd buried surged back, sharp and biting. "I'm not doing this again," I said firmly, standing up. "Not for him, not for you." "Emma, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "He's your brother. Don't turn your back on family." "Family?" I shot back, incredulous. "You've never treated me like family, Mom. You've treated me like an ATM, a safety net, someone to prop him up while he destroys himself. And nothing's changed. You still expect me to sacrifice everything for him." Claire flinched at my words, but I couldn't stop. I tried, Mom. Over and over again, I tried. And what did it get me? Nothing but resentment and exhaustion. "I'm done." Tears streamed down her face, but I forced myself to look away. Compassion warred with resolve, but in the end, I knew I couldn't go back. Claire's guilt tripping hadn't worked this time, and it never would again. She still saw me as expendable, just as she always had. Walking out of that room felt like shedding a second skin. Each step toward the exit lightened the invisible chains I'd carried for so long. Outside, the crisp autumn air hit my face, grounding me in the present. I climbed into my car and sat there for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. Nothing had changed, not really. Claire and Daniel were still trapped in their cycles of manipulation and self-destruction, and I couldn't save them. But I could save myself. And that realization, painful as it was, felt like freedom. Walking away from Claire that day felt like shedding a second skin, painful, raw, but ultimately liberating. I didn't look back as I stepped out of the assisted living facility, my heels clicking against the pavement with a finality that echoed in my chest. The weight of her guilt-tripping still lingered, but it no longer held me captive. For the first time in years, I understood what real strength meant, not bending to meet others' endless demands, but standing firm in my own truth. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work, not out of obligation this time, but because it gave me purpose. My legal practice thrived under renewed focus, and I found unexpected joy in mentoring young lawyers. They were eager, idealistic, and hungry for guidance, reminding me of who I used to be before life's burdens dulled my edges. Together, we tackled cases that mattered, advocating for systemic changes in addiction recovery programs, pushing for policies that addressed root causes instead of symptoms. If I couldn't save Daniel, maybe I could help others avoid his fate. But letting go wasn't without its cost. Nights were hardest when the quiet allowed memories to creep in uninvited. I thought about Claire often, the frailty in her voice, the desperation in her eyes. And Daniel, Daniel, was he safe, warm, alive? I scoured social media, asked mutual acquaintances, even drove by places he used to frequent, hoping for some sign of him. But there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, word reached me through vague whispers. Claire had moved into an assisted living home, her health declining rapidly. As for Daniel, he'd vanished entirely, leaving behind only rumors of shelters and bus stations. Each update hit like a hammer blow, forcing me to confront the harsh reality of their choices, and mine. Yet amidst the ache, something else began to take root: fulfillment. Not the fleeting satisfaction of solving someone else's problem or patching up yet another crisis, but the deep, steady kind that comes from building a life on your own terms. I started small, joining a book club, taking weekend trips to nearby towns, rediscovering hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. Slowly, I pieced together fragments of myself I hadn't realized were missing. It wasn't perfect. Grief and regret still surfaced at odd moments, catching me off guard. But they didn't define me anymore. Meanwhile, Claire and Daniel's downward spiral served as a stark reminder of everything I'd feared and fought against for so long. Without my financial support, their lives unraveled further. Claire's refusal to seek help beyond what she could control left her isolated, dependent on strangers in the sterile confines of assisted living. And Daniel's absence spoke volumes. His inability or unwillingness to break free from self-destruction painted a grim picture of where enabling behavior inevitably led. Part of me mourned them, wished I could turn back time and rewrite our story. But another part knew better. Saving them would have required more than money or effort. It would have required them wanting to be saved. And that was never something I could give. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights twinkle below, I reflected on how far I'd come. Gone was the woman who tied her worth to other people's approval, who sacrificed herself endlessly in pursuit of an unattainable ideal. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, freer, someone who recognized the difference between love and martyrdom. And though my heart still bore scars from what might have been, I also carried gratitude for the lessons learned, the boundaries set, and the life I was finally brave enough to claim as my own. Whatever happened to Claire and Daniel, I couldn't carry it anymore. Their struggles weren't mine to fix. Not this time. The city stretched out before me, its lights twinkling like stars scattered across an endless horizon. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, the cool night air brushing against my skin, carrying with it the faint hum of life below. Cars honked in the distance, voices rose and fell, and somewhere a siren wailed, a reminder that the world kept moving, even when you wanted it to stop. But for the first time in years, I felt still inside, grounded, like I'd finally found solid footing after wandering through quicksand for so long. I thought about how far I'd come, from the girl who had tied her worth to her family's approval to the woman standing here now, confident in her ability to set boundaries and protect her peace. It wasn't a straight path. There were detours, missteps, moments where doubt clawed at me like a riptide threatening to pull me under. But each step, no matter how painful or uncertain, had led me here, to this moment, to this clarity. Claire and Daniel lingered in my mind, their faces etched into memory like faded photographs. Part of me would always carry them. The laughter we shared, the fleeting glimpses of love, the weight of everything left unsaid. Those scars wouldn't disappear overnight, but they no longer defined me. They were just pieces of my story, not the whole thing. And maybe that was the hardest lesson of all, accepting that some people will never change, no matter how much you hope they will. That didn't make them unworthy of love. It just meant their choices weren't mine to fix. A soft breeze swept past, tugging at the edges of my resolve. For a brief second, I wondered what Claire and Daniel were doing right now. Were they together? Had Daniel found a way to survive on the streets? Or had he disappeared completely? Was Claire sitting alone in her assisted living room, staring out the window like she used to do when Dad died? The questions bubbled up unbidden, but I forced myself to let them go. Their lives weren't mine to carry anymore. Whatever happened to them, I couldn't save them. Not from themselves, not from their choices. And honestly, why should I have to? You can't save people who don't want to be saved. I whispered into the night, the words tasting foreign yet true as they left my lips. My voice barely carried over the sounds of the city, but saying them aloud made them real, solid, and you deserve better. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about me, about choosing myself for once instead of waiting for someone else to choose me, about building a life rooted in purpose rather than obligation. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped looking for validation from others and started giving it to myself. It wasn't perfect. There were days when guilt still crept in, when old habits threatened to resurface, but it was enough, more than enough. Turning away from the railing, I stepped back inside, closing the glass door behind me. The warmth of my apartment enveloped me, a stark contrast to the chill outside. My gaze drifted to the bookshelf in the corner, where photos of friends and colleagues now outnumbered those of my family. Each frame told a different story, one of growth, connection, resilience. A reminder that while the past shaped me, it didn't control me. As I settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, I allowed myself a small smile. This was my life now. Not perfect, not easy, but mine. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Throughout this journey, I've wrestled with questions that don't have easy answers. How do you balance love for your family with the need to protect yourself? For years, I poured everything I had into fixing what was broken: Daniel's addiction, Mom's grief, the fractured pieces of our lives. But it cost me my peace, my sense of self-worth. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's martyrdom. And somewhere along the way, I realized that staying didn't help them, it enabled them. Letting go wasn't an act of cruelty. It was one of clarity. Sometimes the greatest act of love is stepping back, so others can face their own truths. Forgiveness and self-preservation felt like opposing forces pulling me in different directions. Could I forgive Claire for favoring Daniel, for seeing me as expendable? Could I forgive Daniel for squandering every chance at redemption? Yes, but not at the expense of losing myself again. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing harm or reopening old wounds. It means releasing the hold those hurts have on you while still protecting your boundaries. In the end, I chose both, forgiving them but refusing to be drawn back into their chaos. Breaking free from cycles of manipulation and guilt meant redefining what family loyalty looked like. Loyalty isn't about sacrificing yourself endlessly. It's about showing up in ways that are healthy and sustainable. For years, I thought letting go would make me selfish. But now I see it differently. By choosing myself, I gave us all a chance to heal, even if that healing happens separately. True freedom isn't just walking away. It's finding the courage to live authentically, unshackled by guilt or obligation. That's how you break the cycle, not just for you, but for everyone caught in its grip.